Hi, I'm Simon Drew, and you're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to find more episodes of the show, as well as articles and information about my one-on-one alignment coaching, then you can head to my website. It's simonjedrew.com. If you do have the means to support the show, then I'd love to see you in my Patreon community. Just go to patreon.com/simonjedrew, where you'll also get access to over 240 episodes recorded before 2020. But for now, enjoy the show. Hey everybody, thank you so much for spending your time here listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast today. Now, as you'll all know for sure, I'm particularly interested in the chaos that is the American political system at the moment, and I've been kind of talking about it on and off throughout the podcast all of this year. And a few months ago, I was actually scrolling through YouTube and I came across a particularly insightful TED Talk by our guest today talking about the electoral system in America. And our guest today is none other than Lawrence Lessig. And I'm so grateful that Lawrence came on the show because it's such a fascinating topic to discuss, you know, the really chaotic systems that have kind of embedded themselves into the United States political system at the moment. And you know, it's almost as if there's no way out of it, but if there is a way out of it, then we're going to find that way through people like Lawrence. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lawrence before we jump in, and then we're going to get straight into this interview. So Lawrence Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School, prior to which he founded the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School and taught at the University of Chicago. Founder of Equal Citizens and a founding board member of Creative Commons, Lessig serves on the scientific board of AXA Research Fund and has received numerous awards including a Webby, Free Software Foundation's Freedom Award, Scientific America 50, and Fastcase 50 awards. Cited by The New Yorker as the most important thinker on intellectual property in the internet era, Lessig's current work addresses institutional corruption, relationships which, while legal, weaken public trust in an institution, especially as that affects democracy. His books include They Don't Represent Us in November 2019, Fidelity and Constraint, How the Supreme Court Has Read the American Constitution, May 2019, America Compromised, 2018, Republic Lost, version 2 in 2015, Republic Lost, How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It in 2011, among many others. Lessig holds undergraduate degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in philosophy from Cambridge University, and a Juris Doctorate from Yale. So, without any further ado, I want to present to you my amazing guest for today, Lawrence Lessig. Okay, so Lawrence, mate, I'm really grateful that you've come on the show. This is such a good opportunity to talk to you, especially in a time like this with America and the state that it's in. You know, we need to be talking to people like you who have obviously had experience in the government, in you know, helping people to push forward positive agendas. And I guess I want to start by allowing you to introduce yourself and tell the audience who will be listening a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
So I'm a law professor at Harvard, although most of my work, especially over the past dozen years, has been focused on democracy reform, trying to turn the American government into something we could properly call a representative democracy. And so that's involved building organizations and building movements and trying to engage and push for reform wherever that's possible.
And I wanted to ask from the start as well, you know, when I emailed you, in your reply back to me, you said I could probably use a bit of Stoicism at a time like this. And I wondered, you know, because I didn't reach out to you because I knew that you were interested in Stoicism or had ever learned about Stoicism. But, you know, what has been your experience learning about Stoicism, and why would you say that now is a time that we need a little bit of Stoicism?
Oh, I wouldn't say I have any deep understanding of Stoicism. I studied philosophy 150 years ago when I went to university in Cambridge. But I was referring more to I think that there's this weird sense that everyone's beginning to develop that the presumptions of, the past 40 years that the world's going to get to be a better place, more comfortable, more um, uh, connected in a positive way, are not to be taken for granted. And so, in some sense, hunkered down in quarantine as my family is here and has been for the last, feels like 6 years. I think we have to come to understand how we live with less. We understand how we are able to get through adversity without it affecting our capacity to be human. And that's something kind of new for Americans, even though, obviously many people around the world live life perpetually in that state. They've been living in that state since the beginning of time. And so it's something new for us, but not necessarily for anyone else.
Mm. And, I kind of wanted to ask straight off from the start, why did you originally get into law? And why were you so interested in politics as well?
Well, I got into law. I graduated in the university in the United States studying economics and economic history, and then I went to Cambridge in England to study philosophy, and I loved philosophy, and I toyed seriously with becoming an academic in philosophy, getting a PhD. But at the last moment, I was obsessed with Wittgenstein in philosophy, and it seemed something internally incoherent to be obsessed with Wittgenstein and then decide to get a PhD in philosophy. And so it seemed like law would be a more practical kind of philosophy, and so that's what led me into law. And law school, where I graduated from Yale, was in many ways deeply philosophical, although it's focused on a very practical question of how do we order and improve justice within society. And so, that was a perfect fit and allowed me to quickly move into becoming an academic. I became involved in activism. Really, I never got into law. I didn't want to become a law professor because I wanted to be an activist. I got into law and becoming a professor because I love the idea of reading and writing. And the striking thing about, maybe it's true in all academic disciplines, but it's especially true in law, nobody reads anybody. So that I experienced that as a certain kind of freedom because I felt like I could just write what I thought and cared about. I didn't really have to worry about what other people were thinking as they read it. Um, but at a certain stage, at the turn of at the end of the last century, I began to feel like there were so many fundamental uh, flaws within the policy that our government was pursuing in a lot of areas. I was at that time focused in the area of the internet and copyright policy. But it wasn't, as a citizen, hard to recognize that climate change, healthcare policy, policy to advance the middle class, all of these were areas where the government was systematically misfiring. And the account or the understanding of why they were misfiring was not hard to see because it was tied directly, in my view, to the deeply dysfunctional, corrupted form of government that we had evolved. So, in a certain sense, I felt like there was a public duty initially to get engaged on issues that I knew something substantively about in the law, and that was the internet and copyright policy. And then that was pushed into a more general, more difficult, some think hopeless fight to figure out how we can restore something of or establish something of a representative democracy.
Mm. And you say somewhat of a hopeless fight. I think that the sense that I get from, say, your TED Talks or your interviews is that it's such a massive problem that we're dealing with, whether it is the internet, whether it is social media, whether it is, a government for the people. But you do have a sense, I hear from you that there are solutions. You're coming forward with solutions for what we can do about it. And I really like that because, I'm guilty of being that person who always just imagines that things are going to keep on getting better and better and better. But what do you think are the main ways that the world is, or just America in general, is going backwards at the moment? What do you see that's going backwards, do you think?
Well, I feel like so in this work that I've been doing the last dozen years, I've written, really three major books. The first was there's a couple other minor ones in between, in related to reform, but the first was the book Republic Lost, and what Republic Lost tried to argue is that there was a root cause, inspired by Henry David Thoreau. For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root. So the question was, what is the root to the particular flaw in our current instantiation of democracy? And in my view, that root was the corrupting influence of money inside of politics. And it wasn't hard to point to, although what was striking at the time was how contested it was among political scientists that money was actually having a corrupting effect. The weird thing about academic disciplines is that you get rewarded for the counterintuitive. So there was a very high reward among political scientists for, arguing the completely counterintuitive idea that money is not having an effect. And, it's not hard given the way the data is collected or presented to make that argument. So that argument was made, and there was a deeply committed view among many that, money was there, but it wasn't really corrupting or having any deep effect. So my first work was really trying to develop a conception of corruption, which was a plausible, credible conception of corruption within our tradition, and then, arguing that, in fact, our system had become corrupt in that sense. Then there's a second version of that book in about 2015. But the most recent book that I've published is something called "They Don't Represent Us." And what "They Don't Represent Us" does is it kind of ups the ante, or maybe digs deeper for a deeper, more fundamental root when we think about the problem of government. But then it also identifies a problem with us, not inherent in us, but a problem in us crafted or constructed or induced by the deeply divided, polarized infrastructure of modern media, especially the business model of that infrastructure of modern media. But on the continuing the line of the root, or the root cause, the point that I came to recognize was that money was just an example of a more fundamental corruption or problem. And the more fundamental problem was we had lost the commitment to the ideal of equal representation within a representative democracy. So money is an obvious example of that inequality. So in America, members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get to office or to stay in office. But they get that money from a tiny fraction of the 1%. Maybe 150,000 Americans are relevant funders of these congressional candidates. And so what that means is that 150,000 have enormous influence relative to the rest of the nation. And so obviously that's an instantiation of the idea of inequality. But that's not the only example of that kind of inequality. So gerrymandering, in the way that districts are drawn in the United States, affects a deep inequality in the relative political power of people depending on where they happen to live and what their political party happens to be. The way we elect the president concentrates influence in so-called swing states, states which could go one way or the other because of the dynamic of the Electoral College. But if you don't live in a swing state, your vote just doesn't matter. Literally, the president doesn't care about your views because your views could never affect whether the president was going to be elected or not. Or, it's astonishing, but the United States has developed incredible institutions of suppression in the context of voting. Now, many of those are born animated by a racist spirit. Um, but I think the more fundamental way to understand them today is as a partisan, as expressing a partisan spirit. So, if states run election systems, and if you're in a Republican state, the Republican administrators run the election system to make it harder for Democrats to vote. Now, you might think, how can you do that? But when you think about the infinite number of practical details that have to be fixed in order to run a democracy, you can see lots of places where discretion could be exercised in a way to make it harder for certain people to vote. So Georgia is the classic example here. Georgia is a state which is controlled by the Republican Party, but it has an enormous number of, obviously it's a big state, it's got a lot of Democrats. Those Democrats are typically, African Americans are typically Democrats, and African Americans concentrate in neighborhoods which are easily manipulated by administrators. So you'll find that there are fewer polling places, or the polling places have fewer voting machines, or their hours are weirdly structured, or the time to vote before the election day is cut short in those areas and not in other areas. Those are all interventions designed to make it harder for Democrats to vote than for Republicans to vote. Now that inequality too is completely unjustified. But the point of this part of the book was to say, add all those together: money, gerrymandering, the Senate, the Electoral College, the suppression of the vote. Those 5 dimensions of inequality express the fundamental problem of America's representative democracy, which is it is not representative because it doesn't represent citizens equally. So that more fundamental problem, in some sense, I find it's both more challenging and less challenging. It's more challenging because obviously there are many more dimensions to understand and to reform. It's not like fix money and you fix everything. Though it might be that fixing money is the first step to fixing everything else. I still sometimes believe that's the right conclusion. But the more empowering part of this is to recognize that, the fact that there is a common frame for the failure of democracy means that there's a way to understand what the remedy must look like. And in my view, it's a relatively simple remedy. It is force the principle of equality into every dimension of the infrastructure or the architecture of democracy. So force it into the way you raise money, so no longer privately funded elections, some version of a publicly funded election. Force it into gerrymandering, into the Electoral College, into every one of these, so that all of them adhere to this fundamental idea of equality. And I think if that happened, then you would see many of the pathologies that have evolved inside of American democracy begin to weaken and wither is a big word, but make it possible at least for democratic action to do something to remedy it, or at least that's seems to me that's the only path to getting to that. But this is a long answer, and I'm just going to point to a second part of the answer and not going to give it.
Please.
But the more difficult thing for me is, having come to a place where I think, okay, this is the real root. This inequality is the real root, and we have to find a way to address that inequality. The more difficult problem, the more challenging problem, is to recognize the problems in us, the problems in our capacity as a people to engage in democratic action, given we live within this media infrastructure that is so focused on rendering us as idiots, or rendering us as tribal, polarized, hate-mongering citizens who focus exclusively on why the other side is so terrible, as opposed to trying to understand issues in a common way that help us in a fundamental way address the problems of democracy or anything else. And that problem, I have lots of potential solutions to that problem, and I think there's a general way of thinking about what the solutions are. It's all about call it the slow democracy movement. It's all about trying to force democracy into spaces where humans can grok it or reckon the issues in a reflective, serious way. Um, but it's hard to see how you get there. I mean, I could tell you the 5 things we need to do to fix government. I can't tell you the 5 things that I'm confident would actually fix this problem. And it kind of leads us to a place where you wonder, is democracy going to be possible in a world where we are separated, epistemically separated? We see different worlds. We just see fundamentally different problems. And yet we need, in some sense, to be adjudicating that common problem. And I'm not sure how we do that anymore. Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, it was a perfect answer, and I really want to touch on the internet and media side of things as well, because that's obviously such a massive. I mean, it's a huge shift in technology for humanity, and it's crazy for anyone to imagine that that's not going to bring with it an entire trailer load of problems for us all. But in talking about the root of this problem, I really think that that's a good way to go about it. What is the very tip of the root? Where did all this start? When did money become too much of a problem in politics in America? Because I've heard conversations with you where you seem to think that obviously this is not how America is supposed to be, and this is not how it was founded. So when did it start to go wrong?
Well, I mean, start is a hard word to focus because, it's always been the case that money has played an outsized influence on American politics. And so, you can never find a moment when politics was pure or perfectly responsive. But from that fact, I think it's a mistake to infer what many people infer, which is that in some sense the problem's always been here in the same sense. You think about like a human body, you can say that there's always infection in the human body. Like every human body has infection at some place, and the body's fighting it, and it's like dealing with it. But you wouldn't infer from that that there is no infection that can be threatening to the human body. Obviously, you get to a certain stage and the infection is so pronounced, so severe, that it can be catastrophic. And I think that's what's happened with money in American democracy. It begins in a really dramatic way, at least ideologically, at the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s, when business interests and conservatives in particular reacted to the rise of more liberal, sometimes radical views in American politics that was driving for really fundamental reforms of the American political system. So, the beginning of the 1970s sees the establishment of, for example, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And many conservatives kind of see this as a consequence of failing to rally their own base. And there's a launch of an extraordinary number of conservative enterprises who are focused on educating people and conservative ideals and beginning to fuel a conservative movement inside of the Republican Party to change the Republican Party from being what it had been, which is a ideologically mixed party, as the Democrats have been an ideologically mixed party, to an ideologically pure party. People don't know this or remember this, but for most of the history of American political parties, especially modern American political parties, the parties were not ideological. So Democrats, of course, had liberals, but they also had conservatives. Southern Democrats were more conservative in their views than Republicans. And Republicans had, of course, business conservatives, but they also had idealistic libertarians and egalitarians. The Republican Party is the party that gave birth to the Equal Protection Clause and, the end of slavery. So those were mixed parties, but they became ideologically pure parties. Goldwater sort of begins that in a really aggressive way in 1964. But after Goldwater's identification of what pure republicanism would be, you begin to see a shift of the party to the right and a shift in the Democrats to the left. So that change is kind of setting the conditions for the really fundamental shift, the really fundamental shift, happens in 1995. And Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House in 1995, is the cause of this shift. And I think Newt Gingrich, more than any other American, is responsible for the destruction of American democracy. Because Newt Gingrich, when he became Speaker, he was the first Republican Speaker in 40 years, radically changed the norms of Congress. So he told members of Congress, don't move your families to Washington. We'll only work in Washington Tuesdays through Thursdays. The rest of the time you can be home in the district. But what that quickly translated into is the rest of the time you can be raising money to make sure that our party stays in power. And that began the really radical change of what Congress was. And Congress people increasingly began to understand that their job, their primary job, was as a fundraiser. And that's what they increasingly began to do. And, originally many members resisted this idea. They thought that they were Congress people because they were supposed to represent their constituents, or they're supposed to become experts in certain areas, or they're supposed to exercise the job of legislating. But increasingly that, function was separated from the congressperson. The congressperson, the kind of cogs who raised the money to make it so the party could get into power, were separated from the policy people who were, a small number of people who drove policy based on political consequences. That process was quickly copied by Democrats. And beginning in 1995, you begin to see the extraordinary polarization in Congress as Congress becomes this machine for fueling its own reelection. And you can ask, when did it become truly dysfunctional? And it's somewhere between 1995 and today, but it is today completely, truly, totally, absolutely dysfunctional. It's a non-functioning representative democracy. There is no important issue that our Congress can address sensibly, given the deeply corrupted structure of influence that we've allowed to evolve inside this Congress. And that's not going to change simply by getting, one party out and another party in. It's only going to change if we find a way to address this fundamental flaw inside of the evolved form of this democracy.
Being in Australia, you wouldn't think that a lot of us over here really care about American politics, but I think that a lot of Australians actually care about American politics more than they care about Australian politics. I mean, there was a point there where I knew more about American politics that I didn't even know who the Australian Prime Minister was. And I think that that's because we all recognize that we really do want America to do as well as possible, because at the end of the day, if something happens in the world, we're not going and knocking on Sweden's door. We're coming and asking America for help, And so we really want America to do well. And it seems like there's just, obviously, like you're saying, there's just such a roadblock right now. Do you think, I guess this is a question of optimism, but do you really think that it can change at this stage?
I've told this story a number of times, so I apologize if someone's heard it before, but I remember I was giving a speech in Dartmouth, and at the end of it, a woman raised her hand and she said, "Okay, Professor, you've convinced me. It's hopeless. There's nothing that can be done." And I realized I had, failed in a certain sense, because I didn't want to give people a sense that it was hopeless. But when she said that, I had this image in my head of my then 6-year-old son, and I thought, what if a doctor said to me, your son has terminal brain cancer and it's hopeless, there's nothing you can do? Would I do nothing? The answer is obviously no. That, what love means is that the odds are not relevant. You do whatever you can, whether you think you can succeed or not. And I think that that's the same reaction I have when people say, well, none of this can really be fixed. I deeply love my country. Not the actual reality of much of its history, which of course has been deeply unjust and flawed in incredibly important ways, but ideals which have continued to inspire throughout our history and help us move towards a better society at critical points. I love that tradition, and I love the ideals of that tradition. And I feel like, I'm not sure if we can win. I'm not sure if we can succeed in reforming this corrupted government. I just know that we have to do everything we can to try. And, across the arc of history, great nations fail. That's inevitable. They just fail. And it might be that we're at that stage in America. And if we are, we should at least fail gracefully. But I do think that we have to find a way to at least pull back the craziness that gets manifested from the United States. And it's important to distinguish that craziness from the particular craziness that's, triggered by the current president. Obviously, the level of really pathology, really, psychological pathology of this president is astonishing, and it's a true embarrassment to constitutional democracy that we have no capacity to address that. Like the deep partisanship of American politics makes it impossible for the party of the president to question the president, and so even when you have a president who is obviously psychologically, I'm not talking about his policies, I'm just talking about his psychological capacity, so deeply pathological right now, and yet you can't get 4 Republicans to join with Democrats to do anything about it. That's just a failure of American constitutional democracy. But the problems I'm talking about are all there, even assuming, bingo, tomorrow Donald Trump were not president, right? It's not Donald Trump that is creating these problems. It's a more fundamental, structural, systemic reality inside of our democracy. And so, it's sometimes frustrating because people are so obsessed with the single question of, like, how do we remove Donald Trump? And I think that's an important question, because I don't doubt the harm that he's doing to the United States and to the world because of the harm to the United States. But I hope we don't imagine that, all we need to do is to elect a bunch of Democrats and get Joe Biden to be president in order to solve these problems. They remain. And though the Democratic Party has been wildly more committed to the idea of fixing these problems than the Republicans, it's not clear they actually have the votes or the will or the capacity to fix them on their own, at least. So that's it's even doubly depressing, but I think that's the reality that we're facing right now.
And I did want to ask you about this coming election, because obviously a lot of people felt last time like they were being served 2 very bad options that they just didn't particularly feel were for them. And then, a lot of people are going to feel exactly the same way this way. And I'd love to know how you think about the voting process, because there's kind of like 2 camps, right? There's the camp that thinks, well, you should only vote if you genuinely think that the person you're voting for is, virtuous or is going to put forward good policies. And then the other side says, well, you should vote for whoever is going to allow you to not have the other person get voted in. How do you think about voting in America, especially with such elections like these?
Well, look, your strategy is a function of the system you work within. So, we could talk about what that ideal system could be. And I'm convinced, though I think there's lots of important theoretical questions to resolve about this, but I'm convinced that a ranked choice voting system would be infinitely better than the first past the post system that we've adopted in the United States. So if we had a ranked choice voting system, I would say to people, on your first choice, vote for the person who is the best expression of the ideals you have for a democracy or for the future of the nation. But then rank everybody. so that in the end, we select someone who at least a majority of the public actually could live with. So that would be a perfect way to allow people to express their ideals, but actually practically construct or practically select someone who is a majority candidate. And so I, working with many others, are pushing to try to get ranked choice voting in the United States. It's slow, but we're seeing some progress. But we don't have ranked choice right now. So the idea that you would say, as people said, for example, in 2000 in Florida, Ross Perot, Ralph Nader had famously said there isn't a dime's worth of difference between George Bush and Al Gore, between the Republicans and the Democrats, and those were the two candidates. And so he said that's why people should vote for him, because he was different from those two, and he certainly was. But as we got into that election, and it was clear it was going to be extremely close, it was really Democratic malpractice for Ralph Nader not to say to his public, look, we've made our point, but let's be real. You've got to vote for Al Gore. You can't vote for George Bush. But he didn't do that. He continued to insist people should vote for him all the way until the very end. So some 96,000 people voted for Ralph Nader in Florida in 2000. 96,000. George Bush won Florida, according to the screwy way in which the votes were finally counted, by less than 550 votes. So when you say, if those 96,000 people had, rather than voting for Al Gore, voting for Ralph Nader, voted for their second choice, it's absolutely clear that 80% of them would have voted for Al Gore as opposed to George Bush, and George Bush would have been not elected the president. Now, history is a hard thing to think of in the hypothetical, but it's hard not to believe that the world would be a radically different place today had Al Gore been president in 2001 rather than George Bush. Probably would have been 9/11. Maybe the Gore people would have been more focused. I don't know, but probably would have been 9/11. But there wouldn't have been an Iraq war. And there probably would have been climate change legislation, because a president gets the sort of first thing that the president says that he or she, let's hope there will be a she someday, but he wants. And that was for Al Gore, climate change legislation. So, kind of think about the way the world would have gone if there had not been an Iraq war, if there had been real climate change legislation in the United States 20 years ago. And it's not hard to think that that was a catastrophic mistake of people voting in 2000 not to recognize the logic of the current system that we have. And the logic is that because of the way the Electoral College works, if you vote for someone who cannot win in your state, you have thrown your vote away, and you've effectively thrown it for, in many cases, a person who you absolutely do not want as president. So I completely reject the idea that given the way the system is right now, people do not have a moral obligation to vote for the lesser of two evils. Of course you do, because that's less evil. It's like, well, you're going to vote for more evil? I mean, this is the reality of our political system. And, of course, we ought to fight to get a different political system. We ought to fight to get a better, more representative system. And again, ranked choice would be an obvious way to do that. But until we're there, yes, vote for the lesser of two evils. Now, in this election cycle, I understand why people were skeptical of Hillary Clinton. And I'd written many pieces that were deeply skeptical of her. The institutional influence, the kind of economy of influence that lived within the Clinton world was not a pretty sight. It was nothing compared to Donald Trump, who was not just kind of improperly influenced, but deeply, deeply corrupted, illegally corrupted. Donald Trump is a man who has been banned from being allowed to run a charity in the state of New York, legally banned, but he's president of the United States. So nothing Hillary Clinton did was anywhere close to that. But I don't think it's fair to say that the current election is presenting people with an equally unpleasant choice. Joe Biden's negatives are nowhere close to Hillary Clinton's negatives. And in fact, I think that he's benefiting substantially from the kind of craziness of the current president. Now, whether people can bring themselves to vote contrary to their party is a really hard question. I'm not sure that
Yeah.
I'm not convinced Donald Trump loses at all. But I do think that it's in some sense, an easier campaign to wage against him this time than it was in 2016, and I certainly hope that that means that he will be defeated.
Hmm. No, I think that that's a really fair answer. And if we could jump over to the internet side of things, because that's particularly interesting to me, is something that occurred to me recently. I was reading Marcus Aurelius, and he said that something that he learned from one of his teachers was not to pick sides in a chariot race. And as sort of a logical technique of, you're after good ideas, you're after good sportsmanship, not just picking a team. And it seems like the internet has just led us down this direction where we've all become the highest version of team players, where we really are going to vote for our side over picking good ideas versus bad ideas. Do you think this is something that can be fixed? Do you think that the government is trying to do anything about it at the moment in terms of the absolute lack of incentive to do anything other than sensationalized, based on your team?
Well, that's a great question because there's a lot of subtlety built into the way you set it up. So let's start with the easy point. Is the government doing anything about it? Not the American government. No. In fact, to the extent the government's doing anything about it, it's trying to reinforce it by getting its fingers deeply inside of Facebook and developing a kind of dependency inside of Facebook that I think has deeply corrupted that platform. But I think the more important thing is when you said, is there any incentive, is to focus on incentives. I mean, the problem is not, quote, the internet, because there's no such thing as the internet. The internet is a set of technologies and business models. And the business models have changed as much as the technologies have. So the business model of the internet 25 years ago was not advertising. Nobody invented advertising. There was like a couple efforts to put banners here and there, but the idea of using big data to drive advertising was just not in anybody's mind. I mean, when Google was founded, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, both declared that what would set Google apart from every other search engine is they were not going to be advertisers because they thought advertising corrupted a search engine. And they were right. But of course, when the first crash happened in Silicon Valley in the late 1990s, immediately every single venture capitalist was saying to Silicon Valley, you need a business model. And the business model they discovered was the business model that was driven by the exhaust, the data exhaust of the internet, which is, basically the data that you reveal by the way you use the network. So Google had used this a little bit. I mean, Google's design was originally to use this initially in like figuring out how to run a search engine. So, Google would give you 10 results to a certain query, and it would watch which one you picked. And based on which one you picked, it began to figure out what was the right answer to this question. So that was, in a certain sense, using the byproduct of your interaction on the internet to make the internet work better. But what quickly became obvious to them is that you could begin to understand the user in a way that would make it possible to target advertising to the user much more effectively than advertising had ever been targeted before. And so there was a race between Google and Facebook to become the best data libraries for modeling and targeting individuals. And Facebook originally, sold itself to the market as a much more efficient data repository than Google could ever be, because with Facebook, you knew who people were really. I mean, they had real identities and they had real expressed preferences, and you could see their life not just in what they searched for on the internet, but who they interacted with and what they shared and what pictures they uploaded. So the potential to be much more accurate in modeling individuals for the purpose of advertising was at least initially thought to be Facebook. Facebook was thought to be the platform that would do it better than anybody. And of course, Google's found lots of ways to compete. But the point that is that was the arms race, an arms race to develop data that could be used to model individuals, that could be used to sell advertising. Okay, well, advertising has been with us for, in a serious way for 150 years. And of course, in some sense, we've grown, we've inured ourselves to to its existence. It's not like it seems like a bizarre thing, but I think that we need to wake up to the deeply potentially corrupting effect of advertising. Because if it turns out, which it seems to have turned out to be true, if it turns out that the most effective way to advertise, or at least the most effective way to create an environment in which advertising flourishes, is to put us into these tribal buckets and to feed us information that, kind of like throwing chum in with a bunch of sharks, gets us riled up and angry and furious at the other side. If that's the technique that makes advertising most profitable, that has a huge externality for democracy. If the only way to make Facebook rich is to make America stupid, we have to worry if Facebook pursues their objective of getting rich. And I think that this is in some sense the most terrifying thing about what's happened to the internet. 20 years ago, everybody was worried the government was going to use the internet to spy on you. And of course, many places around the world, that's true. But the bigger problem is that the business model of the internet would develop in a way that would turn it into a democracy-destroying device. A device that makes it increasingly difficult for us to engage with each other in the common enterprise of democratic deliberation or decision. And I don't know how you get out of that. I mean, we are so far down this path, you can't imagine the government banning advertising. It's not even clear you could do it in America, given the First Amendment. So if we've kind of allowed this infrastructure to wrap itself within our lives and become so deeply dependent on it for everything we do, and yet that infrastructure itself poisons us, pollutes the very capacity of democracy to function, how do we escape it? So this is the sense in which I was signaling before, that I in some sense feel like I understand how to fix the government part, but this part is really, really hard. So long as we have businesses that control huge swaths of the internet committed to a business model which is deeply antithetical to the capacity of democracy to function.
No, well said. And seriously, it does kind of, it's one of the massive issues of our time is the fact that we just hop onto these platforms. We give them all of our data. They literally know us better than we know ourselves most of the time.
Yeah,
and, you can probably remember there was, a few years back, it would be the rare occurrence that, an advertisement would come up that was something that you were talking about with your friends, and you'd kind of joke, oh, look, they're listening to us, joke about it. And then it happens 2 times, and then it happens 4 times, then it happens again and again and again. And at this stage, we've all just accepted that we are in this loop that is just making Facebook as rich as possible. Now it's basically run like a government. And how do you even begin to think about the sort of censorship and, Facebook setting up like its own sort of, board of censors? And how do you think about that sort of problem with social media?
Well, I mean, in some sense, let's start a little bit back from that with what you just said about this whole story about when a couple of years ago people started saying that Facebook was listening to you because I'd talk about something I never talk about. For example, I'd talk about cat litter, and all of a sudden on my Facebook feed, there would be advertisements for cat litter.
Yeah.
And what was so astonishing about that incident was that, of course, Facebook denied that they were listening to you. And they said, no, 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 we're not listening. We're not using. It's just that we've developed algorithms that are good enough to be able to predict what you're likely to be interested in at any one moment. And they offered that as if that was in some sense better. That it was better that they had limed the architecture of my soul enough to be able to predict what I would be talking about than that they were listening to me. I wish they were just listening to me, because then I at least know what I need to do. Just turn off the phone, right? But if you're telling me that they have figured me out enough that they can know that on Wednesday I'm going to start thinking about, places I can go swim on Saturday, and they'll be advertising on the, then in some sense, we've deeply given over our identity to this infrastructure of our artificial intelligence. So that's number one. And number two, I initially thought that all of these efforts at sort of corporate governance of individuals, not corporate governance of corporations, but corporate governance of individuals was disastrous, that we needed to reinforce public governance of individuals. And I guess that I've come to a slightly modified version of that, which is, I think we have to accept the reality that these institutions are going to be the front line of governance, not just in decency questions, but in questions of defamation and questions of threat and risk and criminal activity. Facebook's going to know more about the criminals in the world than the police are. Facebook's certainly killed fewer people in response to that than the police have. So that might not be a bad thing. Bracketing Myanmar, which, is obviously a huge issue on its own. But I think that what we need to do, though, is to fight hard against the presumption that exists, especially in American jurisprudence, that once you say it's to be regulated privately, there's nothing more for the government to say. Instead, I think we need to begin to develop a really rich and aggressive set of normative constraints or interventions or conditions that make it possible for these private entities to be certified or qualified to engage in these kinds of judgments. So for example, we have a big fight in the United States about something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically creates an immunity in these online platforms for things like defamation. So, if I go onto an online platform and I say Mark Zuckerberg is a pedophile, I can be sued because I've engaged in defamation. But the platform that hosts my content can't be sued for defamation, even if the platform refuses to take my post down. So if I post it in Twitter and Twitter never takes it down, even though Mark Zuckerberg calls Jack Dorsey and says, hey, Jack, I'm not a pedophile, take that down. Jack never takes it down. Twitter can't be punished under defamation law because of Section 230. There are many people, and I'm one of them, who think that immunity in general is a bad thing, and we ought to avoid institutions that entrench immunity. So, we're thinking about what are the ways to have a better system of accountability than 230. And one response is to say, just abolish it and let's go back to the courts regulating this stuff. But the reality is courts are so deeply inefficient and costly that that's no solution at all. That's basically to say, let's go back to a state of nature for addressing these things. Instead, it seems clear to me we're going to have to think about institutions like Facebook playing a more substantial role in adjudicating questions like this. Now, what does that mean? It means that the government, I think, needs to set standards for these private entities to engage in these acts of policing or adjudicating, what are the kind of minimal standards to qualify as a fair system of defamation adjudication? And if they live up to those standards, then the thing that they do gives them immunity, or they can't be held accountable beyond that. If they don't live up to those standards, then they can be held accountable. But the point is, we need to create an incentive for innovation in addressing these questions of justice and adjudication in a private context, but the private context needs to live up to public ideals. And so I think that's where the progress is going to be found, and we need to think of ways to do it that doesn't sort of turn over the whole of the values of public adjudication into the context of private litigation.
Yeah, and I really like the solution base that you have there of opening up competition. Obviously monopolies are not good for anybody except for the people who own them. But do you think that pretty much social media is in a monopoly already at the moment? I mean, you've got basically Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and I mean that's kind of it, and there's a few coming up. But do you think even if they broke them apart, I mean, they've already got a stronghold, right?
I do think that antitrust authorities around the world have failed the world by not more aggressively prosecuting antitrust ideals in the internet age. It's just astonishing to think in America that the last major antitrust action in the technology sector was the Microsoft case 20 years ago, 22 years ago. And in the time since, we've allowed groups like Facebook especially, but Google too, to leverage their enormous power to basically protect themselves from any effective competition. And in a certain sense, the business model of venture capital has conformed itself to this reality. So the basic venture capital model in Silicon Valley now is to develop a technology that will be acquired by Facebook for some astronomical amount very quickly. So, you look at the companies that Facebook has bought, they were developing really innovative techniques or platforms that would challenge Facebook, whether it's Instagram or WhatsApp. When they got viable and it was clear that their uptick was huge and their growth was substantial, especially among populations that Facebook was vulnerable about, so like young people, Facebook bought them. And when Facebook bought them, the value of Facebook stock went up substantially. And the reason Facebook stock went up is that by buying them, the market recognized that Facebook had basically shut down a potential competitor. Now, the point is, it was worth it for Facebook, and it was also worth it for the Instagrams or the WhatsApps. Obviously, the founder of WhatsApp, was torn deeply because of the philosophical commitments that he had to the infrastructure of WhatsApp. And once it was sold to Facebook, all of the philosophical commitments went out the window. And so he walked away, and then he started attacking Facebook. But the point is that people recognize, I think, that in Silicon Valley, that there's a way to get rich. And the way to get rich is to build something that Facebook wants to eat. And then once it's eaten it, then go on, build something new. And that's a deeply, deeply corrupted form of competition. Because what we need in competition is competitors who really want to kill their competitor. That's the only way that we check the power of existing dominant competitors, and also create the opportunity for real innovation that could benefit society generally. And part of the reason we don't have that is government, because government has failed to prosecute antitrust actions, even in areas where it's completely obvious that they should have. There's a great book by Tim Wu. I think he stole the title of Brandeis's book. I'm now blanking a little bit. I think it's The Curse of Bigness. But anyway, Tim Wu's book about antitrust in the digital age is a fantastic account of like the obvious places where they ignored the law, and the consequence is what we have right now. So, is there anything to be done? Well, if there's something to be done, it's not going to be. You can't take on the monster, you know, face front. I'm a big admirer of Elizabeth Warren, and she ran a vigorous and inspiring campaign for the Democratic nomination for president this time. I thought it was a pretty big mistake that early on she said if she won, she was going to break up Facebook. You know, it created a lot of incentives from really powerful people to make sure she didn't win. And I think Facebook in particular has made deals with the devil. And we know when those deals happened. I mean, he meets privately with the president. And we know that this president has no constraints on what he would do to try to assure his reelection. He is so deeply insecure about the fact that he actually didn't win the first time that he's going to sell the soul of the nation and sacrifice thousands of his own supporters, literally. His commitment now to these rallies will certainly lead to people, being exposed to this pandemic, and how many are going to die because of this? But that's a decision to sacrifice people for his own reelection, and so I'm sure that there was nothing that would lead him to stop making whatever promise he needed to make to Mark Zuckerberg, to get Mark Zuckerberg to make whatever promise he needed to make to the president. And that promise, only needed to be, we're not going to intervene to hold your campaign to any account. And, we'll see whether that's sufficient to flip an election, but it certainly was the plan. So I'm not sure if they're too big to be broken up. I do think we have to get into a position where we have a government that's not dependent on these private interests, and then see what that government's capable of doing.
Yeah, that's kind of horrifying. That I've never heard it. I knew that people were obviously selling companies to Facebook. I never knew that it was almost seen as kind of a business model, that you would create this competitor and then the beast would eat it up and you'd just walk away rich. It's such an interesting way to look at it. But I only have a couple more questions for you, Lawrence, if you have time. The first one really is I want to make it extremely practical for people. Say somebody comes up to you, one of your students, and says, listen, I have no idea how to solve all of these big problems with the government at the moment, but I'd like to do something. What can the average person do, today, whether it is just to vote or send a letter, send an email? What can people do in America in order to have more of a say in the government?
Well, look, as I've said, Donald Trump is not the cause of America's problems. And if he were gone tomorrow, we would still have a huge number of problems. But there is no doubt that the most important thing that must happen is that Donald Trump and his Republican Party needs to be decimated in this next election. If we don't find a way to hold the Republican Party to account for their collaboration with he's not a traitor, he's just a psychopath. Collaboration with a psychopath as president, then there are no incentives for good behavior inside of politics. So there's no doubt that if you have something, if you have time, you're asking the question, what should you be doing? You should be working to assure that this man and his party is not reelected. Now, let's be real, there's a lot that you can do to keep yourself in power if you have no constraints on your behavior, and he has no constraints. So I'm not sure that winning is even enough for us, for our side. But that's certainly what has to happen. We have to defeat this man, again, not so much because of his policies, but because of the deep corruption to the basic ideals of representative government in a system of rule of law, which he certainly manifests. So that's the thing to be done in the next 6 months. After, if we're successful in that, then there's a whole other world of important critical change that we need to take up. And that includes, the whole range of democracy reform that I'm talking about. And that enables the capacity to address the um, the kind of "we don't represent us" problem, the problem of the way media represents or renders us in this democracy. But we don't get to any of those problems. I mean, we'll be lucky if we get to the opportunity to solve those problems, because we're not going to be thinking about solving those problems if this president's reelected. I mean, many people are going to be thinking, how do we get to Australia or New Zealand or Iceland? Because this place is going to be a scary place to be.
Mm. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people over there who feel like that. And, I guess my last question, just a simple one, but I was really interested in finding this out from you. Uh, who is who is the American president who you look up to the most from history, and why?
That's a hard question. I mean, the obvious answers are right for obvious reasons. The sacrifice of Lincoln was incredible and personal, uh, and so one should revere that president. There are also presidents who, we never got to know how extraordinary they were going to be. James Garfield, who of course nobody even knows about because he served as president for I think 6 months,
Mm.
uh, but until he was shot by a crazy person early in his administration. But he was, it was in some ways a genius. He penned an original proof to the Pythagorean theorem while he was president. And he had a deep commitment to civil rights, which at that moment, in the late 1880s, if he had delivered on that commitment, the whole course of American history could have been radically different.
Mm.
But so I admire who he could have been. I think FDR had a conception of transformative presidential politics. I don't agree with everything he was trying to accomplish, especially in the first New Deal, which was deeply fascistic in its conception of, sort of concentrated power over the economy. But the point is, he had a conception of rallying the public to a common ideal, which I think is to be admired. And, in some ways, it's hard to admit because he was such a flawed person. But Lyndon Johnson is the person who gave us civil rights legislation. But for Lyndon Johnson, I don't think Kennedy would have succeeded in getting us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And he was on the course to failing and getting us that. It was Johnson's really almost pathological commitment to success in legislation that led to that happening. So there's a rich array of different people and different reasons to admire them. We should also admit there are so many mediocre presidents in American history, really mediocre people, because for most of the American history, presidents were not important. They were not supposed to be important. It's a good thing they were not important because, at those stages of American history, the idea of representative democracy was representative democracy. It wasn't a king or a kind of super leader. It was like leadership inside of Congress. And we've obviously given up on that idea, and we have increasingly an authoritarian conception of democracy, and that's obviously created the great risks that have inspired people like Donald Trump.
Mm. No, I appreciate that answer, absolutely. And I'm going to be really selfish and just ask one more quick one for anybody. So for myself particularly, this one's for me. Interested in learning more about how the American government works, about the history of the American government. What are some books that you think would be absolute must reads for someone like me?
Well, I mean, minor self-promotion here, but to the
Cool.
extent that you want to pass into this in the direction that I've just offered you, the book that I just finished last year, that They Don't Represent Us, is a kind of window into that. And I've tried to, in that book, like point to the more fundamental sources for understanding this. But I think, the critical thing to understand about American history is the dark side to American
Mm.
history. And so I don't mean dark by color. I mean dark by the less than idealistic parts of American history. And so I think understanding Reconstruction and slavery is the most important first step to understanding American history. So you want to understand slavery, you read a book like The Half Has Never Been Told by Baptiste, which is this astonishing account of American slavery and its centrality to the development or the emergence of America. Like the wealth of America was from slavery, not just the South, but all of America. So that's an extraordinary introduction. I think that man, I'm blanking on the. Yeah, I should have prepared for this. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I know that this was just a sprung-on question at the end. Either way, I'm happy to put links and stuff in.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you. There's a wonderful book. I'm sorry, Kinzer's book on Teddy Roosevelt, which is something about the flag, but that's an extraordinary story of imperialism, the history and the fight for imperialism in America, and the really fundamental struggle with the soul of America about whether America would become an imperialist nation like Britain and Germany and other European countries, or whether it would remain committed to its anti-imperialist foundation. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt, who for reformers like me is in some ways a hero, on this dimension is incredible evil, because Roosevelt and Lodge did everything they could to turn America into a world imperialist force and succeeded, obviously. And so the understanding how we became really the opposite of who we were at birth is like another important critical part of American history.
Awesome. Well, Lawrence, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been really awesome, and it was a pleasure for me. And look, I'd love to talk to you again in the future. But good luck with everything that you're doing over there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to sign up for email updates, join my Patreon meetup groups that we hold weekly, or if you'd like to offer feedback or suggestions for future guests or topics on the show, then you can head to simonjedrew.com. There you'll also find information about how we can work one-on-one together with my alignment coaching, based around the philosophical principles found in Stoicism. Finally, if you are on Facebook, then I'd love to see you in our group, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But hey, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next time.